As Jenny said, I'm one of the regional ministers for the Central Baptist Association, of which this church is a member. So I bring you greetings from Jeff Colmer and from Colin Pye, who are the other regional ministers. If you've got a bit of imagination, behind me there are about 11,000 other people who also belong to the other 152 churches in the association. And they're all saying, good morning and welcome, because we're in this together. I guess we come to any harvest with an expectation of our memories over the years. Perhaps the displays that are there and the displays around the church, maybe singing all things bright and beautiful, or we plough the fields and scatter, and a certain expectation of how we should mark harvest. And that is what we're doing. In Leviticus, that piece we had read to us again, the thing called up for us is to think about the way in which the harvest is used. But Leviticus is a different world and a different time. In those days, there was a much more direct relationship between what you ate and what you grew. When I was in Birmingham, we had quite a lot of Jamaican people who would come over to work in England, and all of the men had small holdings, because back in Jamaica, that's how they had supplemented their meagre wages, was to grow food. So when we came to harvest, we had we had carrots about that size, and we had onions like that, and we'd have melons. So it was fascinating to see the wonders of nature spread for us at harvest. So there was a direct relationship for the Israelites between what they ate, what they grew. Unlike nowadays, when we have large fields and large farms, then the land would have been parceled out to people, to families, to grow their own food. And it was a society that was largely centered upon the male and the head of the family, so that those who didn't have a family or those who didn't have a man with them might be pressed to the edges of concern. And so in Leviticus, the people are reminded not to forget those who are poor, not to forget those who are vulnerable, not to forget those who have no home with the people but are strangers. This is part of their social responsibility. And we saw it a little further on where they talk about being kind to the paid person, not holding back their wages when they would have nothing else to live on. I guess you could draw from this and a harvest message something about the environment in which we live and the fertility of the world and the earth and the dangers of plundering unthinkingly what we have. You could draw a message about the way in which we are all connected together. We all need one another as we come together as a community. You might draw an example of how the wealthy need to be working with those who are poor, perhaps those in our day who are on welfare benefits, to make sure that everyone has a good share of living. As Gandhi said, a nation's greatness is measured by how it treats its weakest members. But I'm not going to go with any of those. I want to go with this, that the people of Israel are encouraged to act like this because that's understand who God is. They are living in the light of God. This is the God whom they worship, who requires them to act out in living, reflecting his nature. And more particularly this morning, I'd like to hold as our theme the generosity of God, because we have a generous God, don't we? Not a God who is penny pinching or narrow-minded or just gives a little bit but not too much, but a generous God who overflows with all the good things that he has to offer. A God whom in our own lives we have recognized, who loves us and redeems us and walks with us day by day. Nothing forces God to be like this. It wells out of God's being that this is what happens. We picked the text, while we were yet sinners, God worked with us. God loved the world so much that he sent Jesus. That like the father of the prodigal son, he doesn't wait for us to come back, but he's looking and wanting the good things for his people. We see this too, don't we, in the life of Jesus? How he put this into practice, drawing around him crowds of people, men and women, Pharisees and untouchables, children and foreigners, those who were sick, those who lacked friends but didn't lack questions, the proud and the self-righteous and the exploiters. Jesus made room for all of these in his generosity to share the good news of God's love for them. He made them welcome. Standing behind that passage we read from Paul, you may well know, was a particular crisis. It was a crisis of money. The people of God, the Christians around Jerusalem, there was a famine there. They didn't have enough to eat. So Paul goes around the churches which he's closely connected with and says, can you give some money to help these folk back in Palestine? Because they haven't got enough. Remember how God has been good to you, how God loves you to be a cheerful giver, and help these people in their need. It's a very practical, very financial thing that lies behind the theological words. For generosity, he's saying, is the hallmark of God. And if it is the hallmark of God, so it should be with you. Be generous. Be generous in your concern for others, looking out for others who have not got what you have. And Paul knew this from his own experience of God, who had drawn him up from a dark place and brought him into the light of God's love. He had experienced the generosity of God for himself, and he had become a changed man. Now he wanted others to benefit from that generosity in their faith and in their giving. The theology, the words about God, become practical actions following after God. There is a proverb that says, the one who is rich is not the one who has much, but the one who gives much. And so I think we gather around this harvest message is one of living generously. Firstly, to be generous to God, although it sounds strange, doesn't it, to say that. But sometimes Christians kind of put God into a box. We think we can frame God in our words and our hopes, our experiences, our worship perhaps. And sometimes it's difficult for God to be God because what we put round is so strong. As an earlier writer of J.B. Phillips wrote to Christians, your God is too small. So when we come to reflect upon the generosity of God, fling wide your imaginations and your experience. Let God fill you again through your reading, in your prayers, in your thinking, in your conversation, and your experience of the love of God. And as you do these things, be ready to be surprised, to be delighted, to be challenged to find God in new ways as well as old. For he is a God of creativity, of joy and of wonder, whose compassion reaches out to all, who forgives and renews and restores and delights. A God who sticks with us through good times and through poor. Above all, a generous God who shares with us without reserve. Secondly, to be generous with ourselves. Let me explain. That's not a sort of sunny optimism that says we never get things wrong, we never make mistakes. But there are times, as you'll know, when Christians can be their own worst critics and risk missing something of the fullness of the presence and the glory of God. Sometimes Christians can be so worn down by their sense of unworthiness, their uncertainty about their abilities, their failure to see good as well as what is disappointing, that it doesn't all come in glorious colours. Sometimes we can be so busy saying to God, we've failed, we've made a mess, we're miserable, we're hopeless, that sometimes, and I don't have a direct line to God on this, but I suspect he sits there thinking, wouldn't it really be nice if occasionally they said, I was really able to help that unpleasant person. I was really able to find something new about God that struck me that was really amazing, and I really feel good about it. I managed to find a word of encouragement when I thought it would be impossible because the situation was so difficult. And to rehearse in our lives and before God the love and the joy and the peace and the patience and the long-suffering and the rest of that list that Paul gives us, where he sees the presence of God in our lives bringing fruit. You see, harvest, fruit, you see. The fruit of the presence of God with us, working through our personalities, our characters, our opportunities, our experiences, and our hopes. And perhaps sometimes we just need to say to ourselves, who is the person? What is the place? Where is the situation where I am living in the goodness of God? The generous God who wants good things for his children. And thirdly, good sermon preparation, you see. Thirdly, 3 points. And thirdly, being generous for others around us. Harvest is not only about what good things we enjoy in our life, in our produce, in our living together, but what good seeds we plant as well. Let me tell you about a film I watched some time ago. It's called Babette's Feast. It's a film that's set in the 19th century in Denmark, amongst a small village, a village which is a little dour, not very joyful, where people are not particularly friendly to one another, where they go to church but there's something missing. And the pastor's daughters have a servant. It's 19th century, they're allowed to have servants. They have a servant who's French, a bit exotic, a bit unusual. And she is held within in the village. She does her job as best she can. One day, word comes through that a distant relative has left her a small sum of money, more than she would earn in 2 or 3 months. And she thinks, what can I do with this money? She looks around her and she decides she will give the people a feast of French food instead of Danish. And so she prepares her menu. She prepares through her cooking the things that she remembered from home, the things that she found were good and exciting to eat and joyful to prepare. And she gets tables laid out in the square of the village and invites everybody to come to the feast. And because no one wants to turn down a free meal, they all come. And at the beginning, it's like it always is. People don't speak. They look at so-and-so who they had an argument with 15 years ago and they don't think kindly of them. But then something happens. You know, as they start to go through the food, they start to sort of warm up a bit. And as they warm up, they start to talk to the person next door about how lovely the food is, and then the person across the way, and then the person down the table over there. By the end of the meal, people are feeling really good about themselves. They're feeling a bit joyful. They're feeling satisfied. The servant goes back to being a servant when the meal has finished. But the people were never the same. And it seems to me there is a picture, a parable there. Perhaps for us as individuals, how we can, without great resources, still affect those who are around us. Or indeed how the church might exert an influence or be a presence for God, even if it's not appreciated or applauded or acclaimed, but simply by being the church and bringing the generosity of God into the situations where we encounter people day by day and week by week. Individuals and the church learning to live generously with others, because that's what they have experienced about God, who does not deal with us in penny weights, but in great and overflowing generosity. And it becomes a statement, and a statement in a world where people often experience life not as fulfilling or as healthy, but as something that reduces them, that impoverishes them in their self-satisfaction, when their minds are narrow or they push people or are pushed to the margins of concern or of resources or of hope. In this world, Christians live out the generosity of God by their words, their actions, and their attitudes. In being blessed, we may be a blessing to others. So, ask yourselves, what does that mean in the world of Brexit, or climate change, or food banks, or nuclear tensions, or a fearfulness of strangers, or a time where each looks out for their own good and does not care about their neighbour? What does it mean to be God's generous people who bring a generous God before the world? And so, this is harvest. We come and we are thankful to God for the planet on which we live, that we share with so many others, for its abundance and fertility and a sense of responsibility. We come thankful to God for calling us into a relationship that is life-giving and healthy, which draws us on, which matures the gifts that he has given us as they are used day by day. And we come to be thankful to God too for those whose lives cross ours, our families, our friends, our work colleagues, our neighbours, the people we meet in the shops or in the marketplace or walking down the street. For these too are God's gift to us. And these too need to hear of God's generosity for them.